Hello everyone, welcome to our first lecture video. So again, our first unit of the course is covering the elements of music. So we're going to be working to build a musical vocabulary to use throughout the rest of the course. So our first lesson is really focusing on the melody. But before we get there, let's talk about some other terms. So first we're going to talk about the difference between the word pitch and the word frequency. Two words I'm going to bet you've heard before. So when talking about pitch, we're just talking about how high or how low a sound is. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to get my guitar out here, and I'm going to play for us a couple different pitches, and I'm going to see if we can figure out which of these pitches sounds higher and which sounds lower. So I'm going to start by playing two different pitches. So here's pitch number 1. Okay, play it one more time. And here's pitch number 2. Okay, so I'm going to bet most of you probably said that pitch number 1 was the higher pitch, and that would be correct. All right, so let's try one more set. So here's our new pitch number 1, and here's our new pitch number 2. Okay, so that time, pitch number 2 was the higher pitch. So pretty easy, really. And then our second term here is the term frequency. So when talking about frequency, we're really talking about the sound waves and how fast or how slow they vibrate. And what we'll notice here from our diagram is the faster the sound wave vibrates, the higher the frequency that comes out. If you actually look at a guitar string vibrating, the strings that have a higher pitch will vibrate at a much faster rate than those with a lower pitch. So if you have a sound wave vibrating slower, it's going to have a lower pitch, and then the faster vibrating sound waves have higher pitches. So we're also seeing here that the frequency will determine the pitch. So based on the speed of vibration, your pitch will sound high or low. All right, so our next term is going to be probably a newer term for most of us. It's the term timbre. So we'll notice that the word timbre is spelled almost like we should pronounce it timber, but we're actually going to be pronouncing it timbre. And another way of saying timbre is just to say tone color. And we're going to define this as the quality of sound that distinguishes one voice or instrument from another. So the easiest way to think about timbre would be to imagine that a violin was playing the exact same pitch and frequency as an instrument like the trumpet. Even though they're playing the same pitch, we would probably all immediately be able to tell which of those is the violin and which is the trumpet. And that's just because those instruments have strikingly different timbres, or they have very different tone colors. So we're again talking about the quality of sound. So when we try to describe timbre, we're going to try to use adjectives that to us sound like the sound that we're hearing. So words that could work for timbre would be words like raspy, or bright, or harsh, or nasally. Really any adjective that you can think of that describes the quality of sound that you're hearing. Words that we're going to try to avoid when talking about timbre are words like loud and soft, because that kind of sounds like volume, or words like high or low, because that kind of sounds like pitch. So as we talk about timbre, let's really make sure we're trying just to describe the quality of sound. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about that word melody. And again, melody is our key word of this first lesson. So the way that we can define melody is a set of single pitches perceived as a recognizable whole. Although an easier way of thinking about that is just the main musical line. And I always tell students a really easy way to figure out where the melody is if you had to sing along with the song, the part that you're singing along to would be the melody. So as we get more into this definition, as you're trying to figure out whether or not something is a melody, typically if you're hearing a set of pitches where there's only one pitch being played at a time, and if you could recall that later, or if you could sing along to that, it's probably a melody. So I'm going to play a couple examples for us on my guitar, and let's try to figure out whether or not these are melodies. All right, so here's our first one. So is this a melody? Okay, what do you think? So I'm going to say that is a melody, and I think that's a melody because that is a set of pitches that when I play it in that order, I can perceive that as a recognizable whole, or I could sing along with that later. That's something that could get stuck in my head, so I'm going to say that's definitely a melody. All right, what about this one? I'm going to play another one for us now. So that's a popular song, and it's also a melody, right? That was a set of pitches that when I play in that order, we can perceive that as a recognizable whole, and that is the Khalid song, Talk. All right, let's try one more. So would this be a melody? So I definitely did something differently that time, right? So that time I was playing several pitches at a time, and there really wasn't one pitch that was always standing out to me. And if I tried to sing along with that, it'd be really difficult to figure out where to sing along to, right? And so on and so forth. So for that reason, I'm going to say that wasn't a melody. That isn't something that would get stuck in my head. That isn't something I could sing along to. It really wasn't a set of pitches that I could perceive as a recognizable whole. So that's something else. We're going to talk more about what that is later on. All right, so moving on to our next term here. Next we have the term range. So range can be defined as the distance between the lowest and highest notes of a melody. So the most important thing about this definition is that we're talking about the melody as a whole. So when we analyze the distance between the lowest and the highest notes within a singular melody, that's our range. So there are three ways that we're going to classify a range. We could say that a range is narrow, medium, or wide. So a good example of a narrow range would be the popular Chainsmoker song. So the lowest note was here, and the highest note was here. So there really wasn't a big difference there. So that's kind of a more narrow range. So for a medium range, we can think of the popular song, Joy to the World. Okay, so that's more of a medium range. And then for a wide range, we could think about songs like our national anthem, and so on and so forth. And some of these terms, like range, can be a little bit subjective. So it's possible that you might hear a song that you think has a medium range, but somebody else thinks that same song has a wide range. That's totally fine. Again, we're really just trying to understand these terms so that we can better communicate why we enjoy melodies. All right, so our next term here is the term contour. And contour just means shape. So when we're talking about contour in music, we're talking about the overall shape of a melody line. So a really good way to think about contour would be to draw horizontal dashes over each of our notes. So by looking at our diagram here, we can see that somebody here has drawn the contour of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. So as the notes are getting higher, the horizontal dashes are getting higher, and as they're getting lower, the dashes are getting lower. So again, contour is the shape. So once we've drawn our dashes, we're going to try to describe that shape. So to me, this looks kind of like almost an arch-like contour, or like a slope-like contour. You could say it looks like kind of a mountain or a hill. So it's important to realize with contour that every note is going to either move upwards, downwards, or it's going to remain static. So, for instance, if we think about that song, Joy to the World Again, that song is a really good example of a descending contour. So every note is getting lower than the note that came before it. So I'm going to say that has a descending contour. Or you could just say it's like going down a mountain or something like that. So we're trying to use, again, adjectives to describe the shape of these melodies. All right, so our next term here is the term interval. And when talking about music, interval is defined as the distance between any two pitches. So that's different from range because, again, when talking about range, we're looking at the melody line as a whole. So with interval, it's just the distance between any two pitches. So there are two ways that we're going to classify these intervals. The first one is by saying something has a conjunct interval, which means the two pitches are close together. So something like this. Or they have a short distance. So when we have a disjunct interval, it means these notes now have a much larger distance. So something like this. That would now be a very disjunct interval. So some melodies have mainly conjunct intervals, some melodies have mainly disjunct intervals. You've probably heard before that the national anthem is one of the hardest songs to sing. The reason for that is because not only does it have a wide range to it, it also has mainly disjunct intervals. So that's what makes it so difficult to sing. All right, so our final PowerPoint slide here just talks about a couple other terms that we need for this lesson. So next we have the term phrase, and phrase just kind of means a musical unit. So if we're looking at melodies almost like sentences, a phrase is where you would put the period. So for instance, songs like the Beatles' Let It Be, the very first line of that song is, "When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be." So that would be like one phrase. That's where the period naturally goes. Or a proper definition here is a musical unit. So then our next term is the term cadence. And cadence is really like the end, or it's the natural place of rest in the music. Typically after maybe 3 or 4 phrases, you'll have some kind of this natural resting place. I typically tell my students that once we get to a cadence, it sounds like the song could stop there and it could work. Or for pop music, typically at the end of a verse, you have a cadence, and then we go into a chorus section, and then a cadence there. So it just sounds like we have this natural resting place. And then our final term here is the term counter melody. And counter melody just means we have 2 or more melodies occurring simultaneously. So again, we talked about a melody just means a set of pitches that we can perceive as a whole. So if we have a counter melody, that means there are 2 melodies happening at the same time. So once you try to sing along to it, there are 2 viable options with a counter melody. And counter melodies are really common in like musical theater, as well as like music from the Baroque period, some music from the Renaissance period, and things like that. But it's not as common in popular music today. All right, so that's going to conclude this first lesson. So in our next lesson, we're going to be talking some about rhythm and meter. And that's going to be technically our second element of music. So I'll see you guys then.